In this video, I will guide you through, not the thunderous battles of the Mahabharata, not the cosmic dances of Shiva or the radiant descents of Vishnu, but the quieter corners of Hindu mythology, the overlooked gods, the forgotten rituals, the slow rhythmic pulse of belief stitched into daily life. This is not a story of miracles. This is a story of repetition, of duty, of sacred tedium. Over the next 2 hours, you will wander through the stillness of ancient temples, the gentle weight of mantras, and the long, uncelebrated labors of deities who worked not for glory, but for balance. 4 segments will unfold like slow-turning lotus petals. First, a daily life immersion into what it meant to serve and invoke lesser-known gods. Second, a mythological biography of a once-revered divine figure whose tales have faded into dust. Third, an exploration of a nearly forgotten ritual or belief system still echoing in fragments. And fourth, a look inside the privileged but duty-laden world of elite divine entities. Gods of great power, tethered by expectations. This is mythology for the weary, for the curious, for the sleepless. Settle in, breathe slowly, and let the old gods whisper as you drift. In the soft blue hush before dawn, when the mists still cling to banyan branches and temple bells haven tea, yet stirred the sleeping birds, you are already awake. You are not a priest of Vishnu or an attendant of Shiva. Those grand names belong to others. No, your world belongs to the lesser gods, those whose names are barely remembered, whose idols are worn smooth by time, whose offerings are sparse and whose praises are few. You are a temple caretaker, a humble servant, and a sanctuary tucked away behind rice paddies and stone paths. Dedicated to Anila, god of gentle wind, or perhaps to Ravanta, the protector of forest paths. Your duties are many, and none of them glorious. First, the fire, not a roaring blaze, a small, constant flame that must be coaxed to life with ghee and breath. You kneel in the dimness, your joints aching from yesterday's repetitions, and strike the flint until the spark takes. The smoke curls upward, and with it, your whispered chant, not a booming mantra, but a threadbare prayer barely heard beyond the altar stones. The god must be woken gently, with sandalwood and incense, not startled. You place marigolds around the idol's feet, though you had to trade half your morning rice for them. There's no crowd waiting, no devotees lined up with drums or pedals. Just you and the god who never asks for much but demands consistency. You sweep the temple floor with a worn broom made from coconut fronds, each motion deliberate. The floor is never clean enough. Dust returns the moment you turn away, but still you sweep. This is not for beauty. This is for order. For Dharma, to leave the dust would be to invite chaos into the sacred. And the lesser gods, though quiet, are precise. A tilted offering bowl might be a whisper of misfortune. A late chant could invite fever. You have learned this not from scripture, but from experience. Patterns noted in the wrinkles of your grandfather's face, in the rhythm of your mother's sighs. The village forgets this temple exists most days. The larger shrines draw crowds, festivals, pilgrims. Yours draws ants to spilled milk and birds that nest in the rafters. Still, you bathe the statue with milk each morning. Still, you offer cracked coconuts. Still, you trace vermilion on stone, even when rain has washed away yesterday's effort. The god must never think they are forgotten, because a forgotten god grows restless. And so your day passes in rituals so old they predate language. Each act is measured not by time but by rhythm. The time it takes for the oil to soak into cotton wicks, for turmeric to stain your fingertips, for the birds to return at twilight. You do not speak much. Words are offerings, too, and you must not waste them. The god listens even in silence. You mend the shrine roof yourself, climbing the thatch with trembling legs and palm rope. You mix mud for repairs when the monsoon tears the walls. There is no funding, no priesthood committee. The god has only you. And you bound by duty, by habit, by something softer than belief, but heavier than obligation. Return day after day. Not because you are devout, not even because you believe your God will reward you, but because this rhythm, this quiet repetition, this unnoticed devotion, it holds the world in place. At night, after the final lamp is lit and the door is barred with an old wooden beam, you sit in the dirt outside the temple. Your back against the wall, your eyes toward the stars. The god sleeps now, or watches, or waits. And you, too tired to wonder, simply breathe in the scent of jasmine and ash. Tomorrow, you will wake before the wind. You will start again. Not for glory, not for fear, but for the lesser God who is no less sacred, and for the rhythm that keeps your hands from forgetting how to serve. The afternoon sun hangs heavy over the dusty courtyard as you wipe your brow with the edge of your shawl, the fabric stiff from smoke and repetition. This is the middle of the day when most villagers retreat to shade, but for you, there is no pause. The gods, however minor, require upkeep, and the sacred doesn't rest when the body begs for it. You crouch near the back wall of the shrine, where a crack in the bricks allows creeping weeds to sneak in and begin scraping moss with a broken shard of terracotta. Every inch of the temple matters. Every stone is sacred. You recall stories whispered by elders of a snake that slithered through an unclean shrine and caused 7 years of drought, or of a statue left unwiped that cracked in two overnight. These stories may not be in the scriptures, but they are etched in your memory, and memory is its own kind of holy. As you rise, knees creaking, you glance at the altar where the god's eyes, blackened with years of soot and oil, seem to follow you not with anger, but expectation. Not a divine wrath, but a constant awareness. They watch not to punish, but because they depend on you for existence. Gods without worshippers fade, and lesser gods fade faster. You learned that as a child, when an abandoned roadside shrine collapsed in monsoon winds, and no one remembered which deity it had held. Was it a goddess of fields? A spirit of lost children? No one knew, and so she was lost. But not your God. Not while you have hands to scrub the floor and a voice to whisper his name. The heat brings flies, and they circle your offerings with the arrogance of hunger. You swat at them half-heartedly, knowing it's futile, but still feeling the need to try. The rice you placed at dawn has begun to crust. The ghee has melted into the altar, and somewhere in the distance, a cow moans. These are the hours where devotion is most difficult, not because of distraction, but because of monotony. Because it is during this long stretch of sameness that your mind wanders. Was your life meant for more than this quiet? Do the larger gods know the names of the smaller ones? Do they hear the low chants from forgotten villages tucked between hills and floodplains? You do not know. And perhaps it doesn't matter. Belief, here, is not a question of answers, but of endurance. And so you stand again, bones protesting, and begin to repaint the goddess Tilak, a red line down the forehead of the statue. Drawn with fingers stained from hundreds of repetitions. It is a small mark. It fades quickly. You will draw it again tomorrow. Outside, the world continues unaware. Children play with spinning tops. Mothers stir lentils over slow fires. Men argue about crops and rain. They do not ask you about the temple. They don't need to. It is just always there, like the banyan tree or the old well. Part of the landscape, part of the rhythm. They assume you will be here, always, just as the god will be. Invisibility is your inheritance. You are not a priest in silks. You do not read the Vedas aloud. But your work is no less ritual. It is the work of holding something fragile in cupped palms, day after day, hoping not to let it spill. It is the quiet upkeep of a thread that others have long stopped seeing, but that still binds. Evening comes slowly. You ring the bell 3 times, not because the god needs the sound, but because tradition says it must be done. The sound bounces off the stone walls, echoing into shadows, and you wonder if the god prefers silence. You light the evening daya and place it in a niche where wind cannot reach. As you sit beside it, you do not pray for blessings. You do not ask for wealth or peace. You simply sit, the way your father did, and his mother before him. You sit with your God, not as a servant and master, but as to beings who are tired, who have no audience, and who know each other only through repetition. The flame flickers between you. The night stretches across the village like a heavy cloth, smothering the last echoes of birdsong and quieting the distant laughter of children playing in courtyards. You remain seated on the threshold of the temple, the cracked stone step pressing against your legs, the flickering oil lamp at your side casting shadows that dance like memories across the walls. The temple has grown cooler now, the clay bricks slowly releasing the heat they absorbed all day. Your God, barely more than a soot-darkened lump of stone, sits inside on a squat pedestal. Wrapped in faded fabric you embroidered years ago, its threads pulled loose by time and rodents. No one else sees the divine in that idol. But you do, not because of faith and power, but because of familiarity. You know where the plaster chipped. You know which corner leaks in rain. You know how the early morning sun touches only the god's right cheek for exactly 17 minutes each solstice. You know, because you have watched, because you have served, because you have stayed when others moved on. And so, the god stays too. Not radiant, not vengeful, but persistent, present. A quiet presence that fills the silence like breath fills lungs. This is not the kind of holiness people write about. There are no miracles here, no visions, no gold-leafed manuscripts or priests in crimson robes chanting before crowds. Your God has no entourage, no retinue of stories, no festivals large enough to shut the market down. But in this small, crumbling temple, the God lives because you refuse to let it be forgotten. You remember. You perform each ritual, each offering, not because you hope for divine reward, but because to abandon them would be to loosen a thread in the fabric of the world. You believe, not in power, but in pattern, not in blessings, but in balance. And every coconut placed on that altar, every grain of rice offered, every flower gathered at dawn, these are stitches in that invisible cloth. Sometimes travelers come through. Rare, but it happens. They glance at your temple, wonder if it's abandoned. A child might peek inside, see the dimness, the cracked statue, and lose interest. A wandering monk might nod respectfully, but not stop. And still you return. Still you sweep. Still you light the lamp. Because your God does not need to be seen by others to matter. And because the rhythm matters more than recognition. Because the act of care is sacred, even when it's unseen, especially when it's unseen. You recall one monsoon many years ago when the river flooded and swallowed part of the village. The newer temples were damaged. Their statues fell. But yours, tucked into a hill's fold, survived. You spent the storm sitting inside, water up to your knees, murmuring the god's name not out of fear, but as if to reassure him, I'm still here. You're not forgotten. When the rains passed and villagers returned to rebuild, someone asked you why you didn't leave. You shrugged. How do you explain that leaving would have meant severing something deeper than faith? That staying wasn't courage. It was habit, it was rhythm, it was duty. Not the kind imposed by Scripture, but the kind that grows from soil, from repetition, from the slow daily erosion of ego. And in this erosion, there is peace. You do not strive. You do not argue. You do not seek to prove. You simply perform. Each morning, each dusk. You tend the God like one tends a garden. Patiently, quietly, accepting that sometimes nothing blooms, but knowing that tending itself is enough. That the God is both stone and symbol. That belief is less about certainty and more about consistency. And so, you gather neem leaves in silence. You smear the threshold with cow dung and turmeric. You press your forehead to the cold stone, not to ask for anything, but to mark your presence. I was here. I am still here. And now, beneath a sky salted with stars, your tasks are nearly complete. The last die sputters on the outer wall, its tiny flame like a heartbeat against the dark. You step out briefly, stretching your back, the joints in your knees groaning with the kind of pain that comes not from injury, but from endless repetition. The village lies still. A few windows glow. Somewhere, a drum sounds faintly in celebration. A wedding perhaps, or a festival for a louder god. But here, in this forgotten corner, silence reigns. And yet, it's not an empty silence. It's full. Full of breath and dust and age. Full of memory. You re-enter the temple, brushing past the doorway beads that hang like a waterfall of cracked glass. They tinkle softly, and you pause to listen. The sound is sharp, clean, satisfying. It reminds you that you not simply keeping a building alive. You retending to a living rhythm, a soundscape, a set of motions passed down not in books, but through the body. You remove the day's garlands, the marigolds now limp. Their once bright petals faded to brown at the edges. You collect them into a worn cloth and take them out to bury behind the temple. In the small patch of soil you've used for years, a flower graveyard for offerings past. The earth there is fragrant, enriched by decades of quiet devotion. You pause for a moment, pressing your palm into it. It's warm. The heat lingers from the day, from the sun, from the endless layering of belief into matter. Back inside, you wipe the statue gently with a cotton cloth, one that used to belong to your mother. She stitched a blue thread into its border so you'd know it was yours. That thread remains. The cloth is nearly transparent now, but you use it because it knows the god's shape. It fits the contours of the stone face like memory fits grief. Perfectly, silently, inevitably. You hum as you work, not a song, not even a melody, just a low vibration from the chest, a habit more than a choice. You do not know when you started humming or why, but it calms the air. It fills the emptiness. And sometimes it feels as though the god hums back through the breeze in the trees or the rattle of a lizard in the eaves. You've never heard a voice, never seen a sign, and yet in your bones you feel a kind of recognition. Not intimacy, not conversation, something quieter. A shared understanding, like two stones warmed by the same sun. Years ago, a traveling priest stopped at your temple. He had books, he had chants you'd never heard, and he scoffed at your routines. "This is not proper ritual," he said. "This is folk religion. This is dust and guessing." You didn't argue. You served him tea, listened politely. When he left, you resumed your tasks unchanged. Because the god had not complained. Because the god was not hungry for volume or perfection. Only presence. Only continuation. You think often of that priest. Where is he now? Does he still chant? Does he still believe? You hope so. But if not, your god remains, quiet, watchful, rooted. You have no successors, no apprentice. When you die, the temple may crumble. The god may return to stone. You think of this often, does not fill you with fear, only a soft sadness like the dimming of a lamp. But for now, you are here, and as long as your hands can carry water, as long as your knees can bend before the altar, as long as your breath can stir the lamp's flame, the god will not be alone. That is your offering. Not gold, not prayer, but endurance. Outside, a jackal cries, its voice thin and high. You close the temple doors for the night, sliding the latch into place with the practiced ease of muscle memory. You touch the wood, rough and grooved from years of storms and sun. You whisper the god's name one last time, as you have whispered it every night. A name that no longer means much to the world, but still holds shape in your mouth. You bow your head. And then, beneath the stars, beneath the quiet, beneath the weight of so many small, forgotten acts, you walk home. Sleep comes late. The cot creaks beneath you as you shift, the rush mat scratchy against your skin. Outside, the night wind carries the scent of mud and burnt milk. Someone left their pot on too long. Again. You stare at the rafters, tracing the dark lines where smoke has painted shadows over time. You're tired, yes, but not in a way that rest resolves. It's the tiredness of carrying something that no one else can see. The weight of memory, the persistence of forgotten duty. You close your eyes and see the god's face. Not bright or terrible, just waiting, as it always is. You wonder what would happen if you did not show up tomorrow. If you left the lamps unlit, the flowers unpicked, the dust untouched. Would the god fade? Would it grow silent? Or would someone else feel the pull? Some child wandering by, some tired farmer drawn in by the hush. You like to think that even silence can echo. That a rhythm, once established, keeps beating somewhere, even if only faintly. You remember your father, his hands rougher than yours, his voice lower. He rarely spoke, but when he did, it was always with finality. He once said, "The gods do not need to be great to be real. They only need to be remembered." You didn't understand him then. You do now. You think of the time he made you memorize every step of the morning ritual, which foot to place inside the shrine first, which hand to use when lighting the wick. You thought it was superstition, okay? Now it feels like choreography, not for performance, but for presence. Like a lullaby that doesn't need to be sung well, only consistently. And that's the word that anchors your life. Consistency. Not devotion, not passion, not even belief. Just the steady return, the refusal to forget. The next morning, you wake before the sun. Your joints ache, but you rise. Not because you want to, but because you must. Because something ancient and unnamed depends on your footsteps. You walk through the dewy grass to the temple, its silhouette barely visible in the gray light. The bell cord is damp from mist, and it takes 2 pulls before the chime rings true. Birds stir in the trees. Somewhere, a rooster calls. You enter the shrine and begin again, clearing ashes, smoothing the cloth, refreshing the offerings. The same as yesterday, the same as tomorrow. And in this sameness, there is comfort. There is purpose. There is, if not holiness, at least honesty. You light the first lamp. The flame stutters, then catches. You watch it flicker, casting golden lines across the statue's face. You place your palms together, not in grand supplication, but in greeting, as one old companion to another, as caretaker to a god too small for history books, too persistent to die. You do not ask for anything. You do not expect thanks. You simply begin the day, because the god is here, so are you. In this segment, we step softly into the shifting boundary between myth and meaning, and follow the divine footsteps of a goddess both feared and worshipped. Durga, the warrior mother, the storm in silken form, the goddess with 10 arms, each holding a weapon, each representing a virtue, each extended not in rage, but in responsibility. You may know her as the slayer of demons, the fierce face of protection, the calm that comes after the hurricane she herself becomes. But here we will not just recount the epic moment she rose from the combined energies of the gods to defeat the buffalo, demon Mahishasura. No, we will sit with her before the battle long after the songs have faded and in the quiet. Echoes of her solitude. Because while Durga is surrounded by praise and iconography, her story, like many divine tales, is layered, veiled, and human in its loneliness. Imagine yourself in that moment, when the gods, helpless before chaos, pooled their strength and created her. Not a deity born of love or prayer, but one summoned as a necessity. She came into being, not from longing, but from desperation. The gods, embodiments of order and celestial hierarchy. birthed her not as an equal, but as a solution, a weapon carved from their own fear. And as Durga took form, radiant, terrible, breathtaking, they handed her their most sacred tools. Shiva gave her his trident, Vishnu his discus, Viyu his bow. Each gift was an expectation. Each weapon, a silent command. She was not asked if she would fight, she was forged to do so. And that, perhaps, is the first layer of her solitude. She walks alone into the battlefield. No army trails behind her, no divine entourage. The earth trembles, not from her rage, but from the sheer inevitability of what she must do. Mahishasura, the buffalo demon who shapeshifts with desire and deceit, has unraveled the order of things. He has dethroned the heavens, bent the laws of cosmic justice, and now waits, a symbol of pride, stubbornness, and unchecked power. But Durga is not enraged. She is precise. Watch her enter the fray, not with screaming fury, but with the silence of one who has accepted the weight of the world. Her eyes hold galaxies, her breath steadies storms. And as she raises her weapons, one by one, she does not revel in destruction. She calculates, she endures, she fulfills. Each strike is not just an act of violence. It is a restoration, a balancing of scales tipped too far for too long. And yet, when the demon falls, pierced, crushed, silenced, there is no cheer, no festival in that moment, only stillness, only Durga, standing amidst the aftermath, soaked not in blood, but in the weariness of necessity. The gods return, offering praise. They call her mother, they chant her names. But where were they before the victory? Why is it only after the storm has passed that they arrive with flowers and hymns? This is the second layer of her solitude. Worship that comes too late. For while Durga is venerated, her image painted on walls, her story told in festivals, how often is her burden seen? How often is the cost of her power considered? She is mother to all, but who comforts her? She is the ultimate protector, but who shields her when the fight is done? Imagine her returning from the battlefield, stepping into the forests, the mountains, the rivers, where the world forgets to look. She walks among humans sometimes, the myths say, in disguise, not to be adored, but to observe, to feel, to remember what it is to be surrounded, if only briefly, by a world that does not immediately demand her strength. But even then, she is alone, because even in disguise, she is apart. Not because she seeks distance, but because none dare cross the space between reverence and recognition. To be a god is to be exalted, yes, but it is also to be isolated, especially when one is made from fear, wielding the expectations of an entire cosmos. And yet, Durga does not falter. That is her grace. She bears solitude with dignity, like the lion she rides, silent, powerful, ever watching. The lion is not a pet. It is her reflection, proud, untamed, unwavering. Together, they patrol the edge of chaos, not seeking conflict, but prepared for it. There are stories where she is shown laughing, where she plays with children, where she dances with abandon. These too are part of her truth. But even then, the war is never far. Even in joy, her weapons rest nearby. Because peace, for Durga, is never guaranteed. It is always earned, and always temporary. Durga's solitude is not a weakness, nor is it born of abandonment. It is chosen, shaped over cycles of creation and dissolution, as natural to her as breath is to mortals. In the eternal wheel of myth, gods rise and fall with each kalpa, and yet Durga endures, unchanged and constant. She is the axis around which fear and hope turn. When the world spins too far into shadow, it is she who steadies the rhythm. But this duty is not adorned with laurels or garlands. It is stitched into the silence of her temple walls, carved into the stone reliefs where her form stands poised with weapons in every hand. Devotees chant her name, Durgatonish Stuni, Mahishasura Mardin, Jagadamba. each syllable carrying both awe and distance. They call her the mother of all, but how many understand the cost of nurturing a world that only remembers her when it's on fire? In the long stretches of time between battles, she waits. Not idle, not inert, but watchful. The world prays for her absence, for peace to hold. And so she waits. In hymns murmured at dawn, in lamps lit with ghee, in the rustling leaves near mountain shrines. She exists in the hush that follows suffering, in the moment before the scream. Her war is not against one demon alone, but against the recurrence of imbalance, the cycle of arrogance, cruelty, and apathy that births monsters anew. And each time she is summoned, she arrives fully formed, not grown, not aged, not changed. Just ... prepared. How tiring it must be to never evolve, to be called forth always in perfection, without doubt, without rest. Her war is not one of transformation, but repetition. That is the third layer of her solitude, the burden of constancy. Imagine now the rituals performed in her name, the festivals where her image is paraded through streets, adorned with marigolds, seated on finely sculpted lions. Drums echo, incense curls into the sky, and voices rise in unison. But amid the music and dance, there is an undercurrent of fear, a tacit plea. Please, Dante, come again too soon, because her presence, though divine, is a sign of unraveling. Durga does not descend for joy. She arrives when the world can no longer hold itself together. And so, though celebrated, she is also distanced. The hymns, the puyas, the effigies, they honor her while keeping her safely mythical. They elevate her to the sky so no one must meet her gaze on earth. Because in truth, her eyes do not gleam with glory. They burn with understanding. They see through pretense, through flattery, through ritual done by rote. And that, perhaps, unsettles even the pious. She is not fooled by gold or garlands. She listens not to praise, but to silence. She knows when fear masquerades as faith, and yet, in the quiet, she holds space for all. No prayer is too small, no offering dismissed. She hears the whispered confessions of farmers, the stifled tears of widows, the muttered hopes of children. She remembers, she witnesses, and still she stands alone. Not because she desires separation, but because no one dares step close enough to carry her weight. Her myth is one of distance, a necessary protector who cannot afford attachment. After all, who comforts the sword? Who embraces the hurricane? She is the divine without softness, the mother without reprieve. But even that is not her whole truth. In some tales, she weeps. In others, she laughs. Some say she retreats to the Himalayas after battle to rest among the snow and stone. There, perhaps, she lets the weapons fall. There, perhaps, she walks not as goddess, but as woman. Heavy with purpose, light with snow. Durga's solitude, though shaped by necessity, becomes a sanctuary, a place not just of stillness, but of reflection. One inaccessible to most gods, whose identities are rooted in constant action or desire. She is not drawn toward vanity like Indra, nor does she disappear into deep meditation like Shiva. Durga remains where the edge of the world frays, where boundaries blur between mortal and divine. In those quiet moments between chaos and peace, she contemplates not just her purpose, but the nature of power itself, not as domination, but as stewardship, as a kind of sacred burden she alone must carry. She is power in its purest form, but hers is not the violent explosion of force. It is the weighted silence of one who knows too well what that force costs. And so, her solitude transforms into a mirror. For the gods, for mortals, for anyone who dares examine the truths that sit behind triumph. She is revered not because she is victorious, but because she is necessary. Necessary to clean up what others let fester. Necessary to undo what others did in pride or folly. The stories of Mahishasura's defeat are sung loudly. But the stories of Durga's aftermath, her quiet walks through bloodless fields, her return to the heavens without fanfare, are whispered, if remembered, at all. That is the nature of being a goddess of war in a world that wants peace without price. Her solitude becomes not just her state of being, but the form of her truth. And in that truth lies another layer, the contrast between her image and her essence. In temples, Durga is carved in stone, regal and distant, or painted in bright reds and golds. Lion crouched at her feet, demons writhing beneath her blade. She is made majestic, invulnerable, omnipotent. But such depictions, while powerful, reduce her to moments of action. Moments that obscure the longer, heavier stretches of vigilance, of silence, of waiting. To live as Durga is not to eternally strike. It is to carry the readiness of the strike every moment without release. Imagine being constantly poised, your every breath a preparation for a war you hope never comes. That is Durga's daily life. A sacred hypervigilance, not unlike that of a mother who must sleep with one ear open, not from paranoia, but from love. She is not restless. She is aware, not anxious, just prepared. And perhaps that is the divine quality we overlook most. Not the ability to destroy demons, but the ability to hold strength without unleashing it. To sit with power and not be consumed by it. That patience, that quiet, enduring strength. That is Durga, and that is why her solitude is not empty, but sacred. Because in her silence she carries all of us, our fears, our hopes, our failings. Not as burdens, but as truths. Even among the other goddesses, Durga stands apart. Lakshmi brings wealth, Saraswati offers wisdom, Kali brings dissolution. But Durga is the one who walks into the places too dangerous for prayer, the spaces too broken for rituals. She goes where others will not, and when she does not ask for thanks. She does not even ask for recognition. She simply acts. And then she disappears. That is her nature. Transient, precise, unclaimed. You might say she is the wind before the monsoon, the heat that cracks the sky, the silence before the verdict. In that role, she finds herself both above and beyond worship. People may love her, but few understand her. Because to truly understand Durga is to look into the mirror she holds up, and few dare see themselves in the goddess who expects not devotion, but responsibility. That is the final depth of her solitude. She does not invite us to worship her, but to emulate her. And that is far more difficult. It is easier to bow than to bear, easier to chant than to choose. But Durga, eternally patient, waits for the day when we do both, when we pray with action, when we honor with truth. And so, we come to another truth embedded in Durga's layered war, the war not waged with sword and lion, but within the stories themselves, where her image is negotiated, reshaped, and retold. Her tale is not fixed, not fossilized like so many ancient myths. It lives. It shifts. In Bengal, she is the daughter who returns home for a few days each autumn. In Tamil Nadu, she is Koravai, fierce and wild. In Gujarat, she is Amba, the mother and the wrathful protector. Each region carves a different face into the same force, layering local truths atop the core flame of her divinity. She becomes regional, intimate, a part of people's own family trees. And yet, in doing so, her solitude only deepens. Because the more she is pulled into festivals, rituals, and personal prayer, the more her identity is fractured, divided between expectations. Some seek her as mother, others as warrior, others as embodiment of Shakti itself. Primal, formless power. To be all of these at once is no easy task. And still, she accepts it, wears each mask with grace, even when the stories told about her contradict or confuse. Her strength lies not in being immutable, but in adapting, surviving, re-emerging. not as a chameleon who changes to please, but as a river that bends around stone, still flowing forward. Her myths are not monuments, they are vessels, and she pours herself into each one, fully, fiercely, silently. Imagine then a temple deep in the hills, not one adorned in gold or echoing with bells, but one old and nearly forgotten. Ivy creeps along its stones. The roof leans inward. Inside, a single oil lamp flickers in front of a clay image of Durga, rough, unpainted, humble. There is no priest here, no worshippers. And yet, the space is full. Because she is there. Not because anyone summoned her, but because she remains. Not as thunder, not as roar, but as presence. You could step inside, breathe in the smell of ancient wood and dust, and feel it. A gaze, a memory, a warmth. The kind of presence that doesn't call attention to itself, but that lets you know you are not alone. This is Durga's temple too, not because it is grand, but because it is honest. And perhaps, if you sat long enough in the hush, you let the world fall away, you might understand what solitude truly means. Not absence, not isolation, but clarity. A space where nothing is demanded and everything is witnessed. Where the divine does not entertain, but endures. That is her most sacred gift. The willingness to be still with us, even when we have nothing to give. Durga's layered war, then, is not just with demons or darkness, but with erasure, with forgetfulness, with the slow fading of nuance in favor of spectacle. She knows that gods-like stories are often simplified for the sake of retelling, and that simplification can erase the very lessons they were meant to hold. That is why she stays quiet when others shout. That is why she arrives only when needed and departs before applause. Because her mission is not to be remembered as glorious, it is to make sure the world does not forget balance. Her weapons are symbols, yes, the conch, the discus, the sword, the trident, but they are also responsibilities. Each tool represents a task, each hand a burden. She is not multitasking. She is upholding. She is the architecture of order wrapped in the illusion of form. And even if temples crumble, festivals fade, and stories change, she will still be there. Not always named, not always known, but present, in courage, in silence. In the moment before action. That is Durga. And that is why, even surrounded by songs and prayers, she remains. Alone, not because no one sees her, but because so few see fully. And yet, she waits, not for worship, understanding. And when the story returns, as it always does in cycles, to Durga's ultimate victory, the slaying of Mahishasura, we must pause and remember that this tale, while often celebrated as a triumph of good over evil, is also a meditation on burden and aftermath. Because the goddess does not simply defeat the buffalo demon and bask in glory. She does not settle into a throne, nor accept garlands in endless procession. Instead, she retreats. She disappears from the battlefield and from the songs that immediately follow. The puyas resume without her voice. The cities carry on with new names and older rituals. And Durga fades once more into the stillness that birthed her. Not because she is defeated, but because the world does not know what to do with victory that asks for reflection rather than celebration. In her layered solitude lies the recognition that peace, when won, demands more than drums. It asks for rebuilding, rebalancing, remembering. And in that quiet labor, she walks alone. She does not need applause. She needs us to understand what we asked of her and what it means that she answered. Few do. Most prefer the image of her atop her lion, weapons raised, enemies crushed beneath her feet. But there is another image, one not carved into temples. Durga sitting cross-legged, weary yet watchful, her many arms resting, not in defeat, but in momentary peace. That image is not worshipped, but it is real. It is the moment between breaths, the space where divinity exhales. As stories of Durga moved through time, through stone, parchment, recitation, song, she became not only a figure of strength, but a container for paradox. She is the warrior who protects but also punishes, the mother who nurtures yet withdraws, the deity who embodies form yet transcends it. And so, to walk with her story is to accept that simplicity will never be offered. There are no easy metaphors here, no clean divisions of light and dark, no hero's journey neatly tied with moral ribbon. Durga is complex because life is complex. She holds the contradictions we live, the moments when we must be both fierce and gentle, both forgiving and firm, both visible and unseen. She models a power that does not ask permission, but also does not demand dominance, a power that exists to serve, not subdue. That is what makes her eternal, not her mythology, but her relevance. And perhaps that is the final solitude of Durga, that even among gods, she remains one of the few whose story continues to evolve. Not because we change her, but because she reflects how we must change ourselves. Now, as we draw this segment to a close, you might find yourself still holding her image in your thoughts, not as statue or festival idol, but as presence, as rhythm, as echo. Perhaps you hear her in the silence between questions. Perhaps you feel her in the weight of choices not yet made. That is her way, to stay with you even after the story ends. It's not in thunder, not in flame, but in the slow, steady sense that something powerful and patient is walking just beside you, watching, waiting, not to act, but to remind you that you, too, carry many arms. You, too, hold weapons of thought, words, action. You, too, must decide when to be still and when to strike. And in that decision, you are never entirely alone. Because Durga does not just live in temples or pages. She lives wherever courage is quiet, wherever strength chooses restraint, wherever solitude reveals not emptiness, but depth. And so we leave her here, not diminished, not completed, but suspended, just as she always is, just as we are, in the breath before the next story begins. In this third descent into the quiet folds of forgotten mythology, we find ourselves not among gods or demons, but among stones. Stones shaped not by nature, but by centuries of hands stacked and carved, painted and worn, forming what we now call temples. Not the grand glittering marvels that draw tourists and cameras, but the ones tucked into misted forests, swallowed by vines, or barely standing beside the bends of ancient rivers. These temples are not empty, even when no priest chants and no flame burns. They breathe history through silence. Each step echoes through time, not with drama, but with the soft footfall of ritual. The people who built these temples did so not for glory or grandeur, but to house stories. Stories that once lived in voices and now rest in stone. Imagine one such structure. Moss clings to its base, the smell of wet clay hangs in the air, and a small shrine, it's barely big enough for one kneeling figure, is carved into its heart. Inside, a linga or a yoni, or perhaps a weathered idol whose features are no longer clear, bears witness to centuries. It matters little who the deity once was. What matters is that someone once knelt there, and someone may again. Across the subcontinent, rivers were not simply bodies of water. They were deities, lifelines, and storytellers. The Ganges, of course, remains the most known, but even lesser streams held sacred significance. In Tamil Nadu, the Kavari whispers legends. In Orissa, the Mahanadi runs through forgotten rites. These waters carried more than silt. They carried prayers, ashes, whispered names, and hopes sent skyward. Pilgrims walked for weeks to reach a bend in the river where their ancestors were said to have once stood. At these junctions, where land meets water and story meets memory, myths were born and reborn. Some were passed down faithfully. Others warped gently with each telling. The river didn't mind. It held them all. Imagine now the rhythmic washing of hands before dawn, the soft draping of cloth. The murmured mantras, the scent of sandalwood on skin and in the air. Not as grand ceremony, but as habit, as daily rhythm. This was devotion, not shouted, but lived. A kind of mythology that did not demand belief, only presence. Scattered across these river banks and temple stones are fragments, tablets, etchings, clay seals, and copper plates. The literal bones of a mythos that once pulsed with life. Many of them lie untranslated in museum drawers or university basements. They speak in tongues few now understand. Grantha, Brahmi, Modi. Their lines arc like vines, graceful and quiet. Some speak of harvest rituals tied to lunar cycles. Others tell of spirits that dwell in certain trees or rocks. Some, most hauntingly, record festivals held no longer, for deities now nameless. The stories are there, just beneath the dust. And the names of gods you've never heard. Marisi, Ravanta, Ati. Flicker briefly before vanishing back into obscurity. These are not forgotten because they were unworthy, but because time, ever practical, has a way of streamlining belief. Complexity becomes condensed, multiplicity becomes monotheism, and the 1,000 local flames are folded into a single divine fire. But once they burned alone, and once they were enough. Now, imagine a festival in a village no longer on any map. It is spring. A wooden pole is raised and circled with flowers. Women sing an old song whose meaning they no longer fully know, only that it must be sung. A clay image of a river goddess is paraded from house to house, then dissolved in a pond. There is no scripture to explain it, no official calendar, only memory and rhythm. That too is mythology, one that lives in bodies and breath, not books. And as you picture this quiet celebration, know that thousands like it happened and happen still. Across a landscape thick with sacred geography, the temples we remember are few. The ones we've forgotten are countless. And as we drift deeper into this river of remembrance, you begin to realize how much of mythology was never meant to be monumental. It was not always chanted in courts or etched into the stones of empire. Often, it was whispered. Whispered by a grandmother stirring lentils over a fire, passing on the tale of a forest goddess who protected their fields. It was muttered by a boatman at dawn, offering a half-remembered verse to the river spirit before pushing off into mist. It was folded into lullabies and hidden in the patterns of rangoli. Drawn at thresholds, symbols that spoke not to the eyes of kings but to the feet of gods. These myths were not told to impress. They were told to live. They were memory made breathable. In a time before clocks or printing presses, time itself was mythologized, with each sunrise marking the resurrection of Surja. Each full moon a sign of divine favor or warning. The calendar was not merely functional. It was a sacred map. Every grain harvested, every well dug, every wedding performed was linked to something older, deeper, unseen. The people did not merely live by the land, they lived with it, inside it, as part of a sacred choreography. And the stories. They were not lessons, they were companions. Along the way, we encountered temple complexes that defy our sense of scale and purpose. Imagine one in the dense forests of central India. Stones covered in moss. A sanctum where a now faceless idol sits surrounded by silence. There are no priests anymore. Only the occasional devotee who leaves marigolds and hopes. The temple is crumbling, but not dead. In one corner, an inscription tells of a goddess who once danced beneath mango trees, drawing the monsoon rains with her steps. There are no festivals for her now, but the rains still come. In another region, perhaps Rajasthan, we find a temple dedicated not to a god, but to a sacred text. A copy of the Mahabharata housed in a chamber. Worshipped not for the words alone, but for the power of their presence. Such sites tell us that mythology was never static. It morphed, migrated, merged. A tribal god becomes a Hindu deity. A Buddhist bodhisattva is folded into the Vaishnavite pantheon. The sacred is promiscuous, not in disrespect, but in adaptability. It welcomes, it absorbs, it survives. And with each adaptation, stories changed, not in their bones, but in their flesh. A tale told in Bengal might end differently than its version in Karnataka. The demon slain in one becomes a protector in another. Even gods were not immune to this drift. Saraswati, now the serene goddess of learning, was once a river. Turbulent, dangerous, alive. Kali, often feared, was once a protective tribal spirit. Ganesha, so beloved, likely began as a regional fertility totem. His elephant head, a symbol of strength in farming cultures long before Brahmin texts embraced him. These shifts were not lies. They were the pulse of living belief. And they remind us that to truly understand Hindu mythology, we must look not just at temples or texts, but at the spaces in between, in daily life, in craft, in the unrecorded gestures passed from hand to hand. Consider now the artisans, the carvers of idols, the painters of scrolls, the singers of epics. They were not merely recorders. They were creators. A sculptor shaping a deity did not simply copy a form. He interpreted it, gave it emotion. A sway in the stance, a curl to the smile. These details were not random. They were theological, aesthetic, and personal all at once. In the Pahari paintings of the hills, Krishna is often shown smaller, more tender. In Kerala murals, Shiva looms vast and serene. The myth was the same. The image changed. Because mythology was never frozen. It flowed like the rivers that cradled it, like the ink in palm leaf manuscripts, like the breath between verses. And through it all, the temples, the rivers, the art, there is a sense of loss, not sorrow, but a gentle ache, because so much has been forgotten, not deliberately, simply faded. And yet, in the act of remembering, we keep them alive. These myths, these gods, these unnamed moments of reverence. You do not need to know every name. You do not need to believe every story. All you need is to listen, to feel the shape of silence in a place where a story once was. That, too, is mythology, and it is still here. And so, as the temples rise and rivers meander in our imagined landscape, we now turn to the people who moved among them. The priests and priestesses, the mendicants and midwives, the singers and stonemasons, whose lives, though ordinary by divine standards, shaped the persistence of myth. Their stories are not preserved in polished epics or royal edicts, but in small acts, unnoticed patterns, and whispered refrains. A weaver in a village on the edge of the Vindhyas ties a red thread into her daughter's hair, not because she fully recalls the story of Shakti's protection, but because her mother once did the same. A young boy in Assam dips a leaf into a stream before drinking, murmuring a name not found in any book, perhaps a forest spirit. Perhaps just a household god known only to his family. These tiny gestures, repeated across centuries and forgotten towns, are the scaffolding of forgotten theologies. The vastness of the Vedas or the grandeur of the Mahabharata often obscures the gentle mythologies that coexisted alongside them folk deities. Water spirits, household protectors, village goddesses who accepted rice more readily than gold. Their stories were never canonized, and perhaps that was their strength. Free from orthodoxy, they adapted to local needs, absorbed local fears, and responded to local joys. And in that flexibility, they became essential. Imagine now a mud temple, no taller than a man, its outer walls painted with lime and turmeric. There are no pilgrims queued up, no pundits in saffron. But inside, behind a screen of bells and mango leaves, sits a small, idle black stone, uncarved, unadorned. The villagers say she is the mother of monsoons. No one knows where the story began. They only know that when her face is washed during drought, the clouds return. This myth may not appear in any Sanskrit manuscript, but it governs the lives of farmers more closely than the calendar. These are the kinds of deities who do not demand loyalty through doctrine, but inspire it through experience. And often, they are women goddesses whose power was maternal and martial at once, protectors of land and lineage. They were worshipped with song, not sermon with firelight, not philosophy. The sacred here was not abstract, it was familiar, present, and sometimes moody. These goddesses could bless or burn, and their myths were always local, responsive, and alive. It's tempting to think of mythology as grand narratives, epic battles, moral struggles, cosmic dances. But in these regions, myth more often looked like a daily rhythm. The rooster crowed, a lamp was lit, a name was whispered. Offerings of rice and ghee weren't made in ornate temples, but at the roots of banyan trees or before household shrines of chalk and clay. In Andhra Pradesh, women still draw kolam's geometric rice flower patterns, mourning not merely as decoration, but as invitation for Lakshmi. In Himachal, stories are sung in trance-like repetition during harvest festivals, the gods speaking through trembling voices and feet that never stop moving. These are not performances of doctrine, but embodiments of memory. And though they often go unrecorded, their impact is undeniable. They shape community identity, mark territory as sacred, and offer continuity in a rapidly shifting world. Even rituals that now appear eccentric or esoteric, walking around a hill 11 times, avoiding certain trees on full moons, weaving specific colors into wedding saris, have roots in these forgotten mythologies. A deity once said to dwell in that hill, a spirit once cursed to rest beneath that tree, a goddess once preferred that color. The stories may fade, but the behaviors remain. This, perhaps, is the most enduring expression of belief. When myth and muscle memory fuse, even amnesia cannot erase the sacred. And yet, scholars and seekers often pass over these elements in pursuit of canonical myths, missing the quiet beauty of what persists not in books, but in breath. For it is in these almost invisible acts that the mythic pulse of a civilization continues. As we drift further, imagine the edge of a forest in Orissa. A family gathers to honor their Kuladevi, their clan goddess whose name is never spoken outside the bloodline. A fire is lit, rice is offered, a goat may be given. There is no priest, no scripture, only the eldest speaking a line his grandfather taught him. This is myth, not as story, but as inheritance. And this moment has unfolded, perhaps unchanged, for hundreds of years. Though temples crumble and rivers change course, such private acts endure. They are not less sacred for being small. They are not less mythological for being unrecorded. In fact, they may be the truest myths mediated by authority, unfettered by orthodoxy, shaped only by love, fear, habit, and time. And so, as the sacred murmurs echo through time, we step into the world of temple inscriptions and river. Rituals not merely as observers, but as sleepwalkers through memory. The temples we now see in ruins scattered across South Asia. Their stones worn and deities faceless were once brilliant repositories of sound, scent, and spirit. The mandapas rang with mantras chanted through dusk. Sandalwood smoke curled upward toward rafters carved with celestial dancers. And the ground trembled softly beneath the feet of pilgrims, who walked barefoot for miles, their chants synchronized with their breath. These were not merely places of prayer. They were frameworks for cosmic order. Every step toward the sanctum was symbolic, every offering a negotiation with the divine. The temple was a miniature universe, its Gopuram, the mountain of gods, its sanctum, the heart of creation, and each regional temple added its own rhythm. In Tamil Nadu, Shiva danced in 5 temples, each representing a different element. In Orissa, Jagannath rolled through the streets once a year, his chariot wheels taller than most homes. These practices were grand, yes, but they were also deeply embedded in the ordinary, in what people wore, when they traveled, how they spoke to their children. But for every well-known temple tradition, there were 100 that faded into silence. Villages with shrines to gods who were once protectors of salt, of bees, of particular winds. These gods weren't less powerful, they were just more local. They didn't demand cities. They dwelled in mango groves, along streams, beneath sacred anthills. Some had no names, just shapes painted in vermilion or stones wrapped in red cloth. Their myths were simple, often no longer than a few lines, but they guided generations. And when droughts came or marriages faltered, it was these small deities that people turned to, not the celestial drama of Indra's court, but the earthiness of a tree goddess who had once shielded a grandmother during childbirth. In this way, mythology lived not in text, but in terrain. And that terrain, too, held stories. Consider the rivers not just as water, but as goddesses, mothers, judges. Ganga descended from the heavens, and to receive her without shattering the earth, Shiva caught her in his hair. This myth is known, but elsewhere there are smaller river deities, Saraswati, who vanished underground, Yamuna, who flows beside her brother Yama, the god of death. Each river had a personality, a rhythm, a flavor. Pilgrims didn't just travel to see them, bathed in them, drank from them, and sometimes wept into them. The rivers were not metaphors. They were relatives, and their moods mattered. A flood wasn't just a natural event, was divine wrath or cleansing. A dry season wasn't just climate, was a sign, perhaps, of a forgotten offering. And at the Ghats, where the water met stone, families whispered prayers not for favor, but for forgiveness for forgotten rituals, neglected shrines, promises not kept. The river listened, or so they believed. And that belief shaped behaviors, shaped architecture, shaped entire cities. It is in these confluences of belief and geography that the most elusive myths live, the ones with no central deity, no epic war, no moral lesson. Instead, they offer moods, a valley that feels sacred without explanation, a hill where people lower their voices, a wind that carries the scent of jasmine and memory. These are places where mythology and land become indistinguishable, where stories rise from soil rather than scripture. Archaeologists may uncover the stones, but they rarely retrieve the softness, the way children were told not to run near that banyan, not because of snakes, but because of the spirit said to sleep there. These were not rules, they were reminders that the world was once full of presence, not just divine presence, but mythic weight. Even silence in these places felt storied. And among the most mysterious remnants of this mythic geography are the lost temples. Foundations unearthed in fields, mentioned in colonial reports, memories fading with a last elder of a village. A temple that once worshipped a sun goddess with a flaming crown. Another that honored a hermit god whose only ritual was stillness. Some of these deities never made it to the mainstream pantheon. Their stories ended when their worshippers died. And yet, something lingers. Maybe in a name still given to children. Maybe in the shape of a pot still used in ceremonies. Maybe in the lullaby that ends with a line no one quite understands. These fragments, unrecorded and unrepeated, are not failures of myth. They are its breath, fleeting, warm, human. Not meant to last forever, only long enough to matter once. And so we arrive at the quiet end of this segment, where the ancient temples begin to blur into the hills and fields around them, and where the sacred rivers recede into mist, taking with them the last whispers of forgotten stories. Here, the myths are not just stories passed down, they are echoes etched into the stone, ripples in the water, and wind patterns that stir banyan leaves in precise, familiar ways. In the fading light of historical memory, what remains is not the bold declarations of empires or the booming voices of warrior gods, but the soft repetitions of belief. A woman drawing a lotus on her doorstep at dawn, a man placing turmeric on a stone each Thursday. A child tracing patterns in the dust without knowing why. The power of mythology was never merely in its ability to explain the world, but in how it taught people to move through it. What to touch, what to avoid, how to mourn, when to celebrate, and above all, how to remember. These quiet rituals carried across generations without scrutiny or scripture are the true arteries of myth. And perhaps the most profound truths lie not in the elaborate texts we now study, but in the habitual silence of millions, who never questioned why they whispered a name before crossing a threshold or left a drop of milk on a flat stone. They simply did. And in that doing, memory became rhythm, and rhythm became reverence. The forgotten gods of India's mythological landscape did not vanish because they lost power or believers. They faded because they were never the type to insist on permanence. Unlike the grand pantheon whose names traveled through dynasties and manuscripts, these quieter deities moved sideways through Timbuktu metaphors, local expressions, cooking practices, architectural flourishes, the choice of a lullaby melody. The goddess who once received a buffalo's heart may now be evoked with a packet of sinjor placed under a tree. The river god who once judged the truth of a man's soul may now simply be honored by folding hands before a glass of water. It is in these reduced forms that their endurance is most evident. They didn't need cathedrals or philosophies. They only needed continuity. And continuity, like water, can take many shapes. These stories survived not because they were told, but because they were lived. Even the architecture of myth evolved to adapt to these silent shifts. Old temples reused for new gods. Older symbols painted over, but not erased. Altars that shifted names but kept the same scent of camphor and ghee. In some shrines, you can see this palimpsest clearly. A Shiva lingam placed beside a snake idol from a tribal tradition. Both doused in the same milk offering, both receiving prayers from the same hand. In such moments, mythology reveals its true genius, as a dogma that divides, but as a language of merging. It takes in the old, the foreign, the eccentric, and folds them into a rhythm of ritual. The names may change, the stories may shift, but the act of reverence remains unchanged. And it is in this repetition that myths live on less as scripture and more as breathing space. Consider also the emotional endurance of these myths, the comfort they offer, the structure they provide even in their simplest forms. A grandmother telling a bedtime story about a talking cow who saved a village from famine may not reference any known epic, but in her voice lives the cadence of ancestral memory. A street-side vendor lighting incense before a shapeless rock may not know the name of the goddess it represents, but she feels her presence nonetheless. These myths aren't broken or decayed, they are dispersed. Like pollen on the wind, they settle where they are needed, bloom in obscure corners, and carry with them the DNA of forgotten epics. In the end, mythology is not a fixed map, but a drifting constellation. Some stars are bright and easy to name: Ram Krishna, Durga, others flicker faintly at the edges: Mariamman, Ayanar, unknown village spirits, but all contribute to the shape of the sky. And when we gaze upward or inward, is not always the brightest stars that guide us home, but those that remain just visible enough to form a pattern, to offer direction. The myths we remember easily are not always the ones that shaped us most. Often it is the myths we've half forgotten. It's the ones we've internalized through ritual and gesture that root us most deeply in the soil of our heritage. As we leave this segment and prepare to descend into another layer of mythological experience, let us carry this thought, that silence does not mean absence, that the gods who no longer receive formal worship may still be watching, still listening, still living through our habits, that a temple crumbled by time may still hold the pulse of prayer in its stones, and that the most sacred stories are not always those we speak aloud, but those we feel when we do not even realize we are remembering. In this final descent into the mythological sleepwalk of ancient India, we step beyond the temples and rivers and forgotten altars of the previous segment to enter the realm of the divine elite. Not gods in the abstract sense, but gods as social actors, as members of a structured celestial society, a hierarchy that mirrored, enforced, and sometimes even challenged the caste and class orders of the humans who worshipped them. This segment is not about stories of war, or love, or cosmic origin. but about what it meant to exist as a god within the architectural and ceremonial complexity of divine palaces, within the system of roles, duties, and privileges that mimicked royal courts. Imagine, for a moment, the divine assembly in Vaikuntha, Vishnu's celestial abode, or Mount Kailasa, Shiva's snowy seat. These were not empty heavens, they were elaborate, hierarchical institutions. Devas had ranks, responsibilities, and rivalries. Some were attendants, others council members, some merely messengers. There were guards at the gates, scribes who recorded karmic balance sheets, and divine clerks who filed petitions brought by mortals. Much like human kingdoms, the divine realms were not chaotic orgies of power, but ordered bureaucracies of cosmic influence. And in this structure, every god had a place, not always equal, not always respected, but always defined. Consider the way mythology in Hindu tradition so often encodes divine roles in alignment with caste expectations. The creator Brahma, who births the cosmos, is linked with the priestly class, the Brahmins. He sits at the top, but is curiously absent from worship. Vishnu, the preserver, is tied to the Kshatriyas, the warrior rulers, the maintainers of dharma and social order. Shiva, the destroyer and renewer, often straddles categories, sometimes aloof and ascetic like a renouncer, other times engaged and furious like a king. These deities are not static symbols. They rotate through roles that reflect and reinforce the complexities of caste-based duty. Even their consorts play into these social scripts. Lakshmi, goddess of wealth and fertility, behaves like a dutiful queen, managing palace affairs and distributing blessings through ceremony. Saraswati, goddess of knowledge, remains more elusive and autonomous, like the learned sage who dwells outside politics. Parvati, as consort to Shiva, mediates between his ascetic wildness and the demands of domestic dharma. These divine personalities were not just metaphysical, they were aspirational. Through their stories, people absorbed subtle cues about how to behave, where to aspire, and what boundaries not to cross. And yet, within this polished celestial framework, there were cracks where lower gods struggled for recognition, where asuras and rakshasas demonized in text were sometimes just disempowered beings from earlier myth systems. Divine hierarchy, like social hierarchy, was not always fair. Some gods, like Surya, the sun, enjoyed enduring status across regions and time. Others, like Chandra the moon or Vayu the wind, fluctuated in importance depending on the theological fashion of the age. The Vedic gods, Agni and Indra, once mighty in hymns, gradually lost prestige as Puranic deities took over the narrative space, and many local gods never entered the pan-Hindu canon at all. Their palaces were not golden towers in heaven, but modest shrines at the edge of a village, their rituals known only to a specific community. Still, within their worlds, they too ruled. They too dispensed justice, accepted offerings, enforced taboos, and participated in the same divine rhythm. It is here we see the blend of political theology and devotional intimacy. The architecture of godhood mirrored the human desire for order, stability, and sometimes for rebellion. The palaces of the gods were more than metaphor. In temple architecture and in the cosmic diagrams used in rituals. The divine palace is a sacred centaura mandala with gates, guardians, inner chambers. These layouts were replicated in temples across India. The sanctum sanctorum, or garbhagriha, was the womb room where the deity resided silent, unmoving, distant from the bustling rituals outside. Only the highest priest could enter. Offerings would pass through layers of intermediaries, just like in a royal court. The devotee was never alone with God. They were part of a protocol, a choreography of access. And just as kings issued decrees and judged petitions, gods were approached through mantras, through scheduled festivals, through calendars marked with auspicious dates. In these arrangements, the gods did not just exist, they reigned. And their reigns were long, often beyond human memory, but not beyond human imagination. For to imagine their palaces was to model earthly palaces. To understand their authority was to justify earthly authority. The king, after all, was but a shadow of Vishnu, an echo of Indra. The palace was divine because it mimicked heaven, or so the scriptures claimed. And thus, the structure of power was sanctified. This close relationship between myth and monarchy created a unique symbiosis. Dynasties claimed descent from gods. Emperors performed rituals invoking divine presence, not just for personal glory, but to stabilize the cosmos. Temple donations were not acts of charity, but contracts of reciprocity. The more lavish the offering, the more powerful the blessing. And temples became centers of economic and social life, just places of worship, but landlords, employers, judges. The gods, ensconced in their palace-like temples, became landlords of actual land. Festivals became public displays of divine order. With caste roles clearly delineated, Brahmins leading chants, artisans decorating chariots, merchants funding processions, and the lower castes cleaning streets and playing drums. Every action affirmed the celestial hierarchy mirrored on earth. But beneath this order simmered tension. Myths of rebellion, of asuras challenging devas, of trickster gods like Krishna. Appending norms remind us that the divine hierarchy was not without friction. Some myths celebrated obedience, but others cherished transgression. Even the gods, it seemed, had to contend with boundaries, jealousies, demotions. As we conclude this first glance into divine palace life and caste-coded mythology, the image that lingers is not one of serenity, but of delicate balance. Gods were powerful, yes, but they were also bound. By protocol, by expectation, by a divine bureaucracy as rigid as any human one. They granted boons, but feared curses. They accepted worship, but relied on ritual accuracy. They ruled over worlds, but often did so while caught in cycles of duty, penance, and rebirth. And in this strange tension between supremacy and servitude, they resembled not just kings, but the people who knelt before them. Gods in Hindu mythology are not always omnipotent. Sometimes they're exhausted, confused, even tricked. And that, perhaps, is what made them so enduring. Not because they were above the world, but because they, too, were part of its architecture. In the rich, palatial rhythm of temple life, divine hierarchy mirrored the mortal one with startling precision. And the gods of Hindu mythology were not distant, omnipotent entities removed from the concerns of the material world, but rather active participants in a cosmic bureaucracy that extended its influence into every stone corridor, every flickering oil lamp, every prayer muttered in the quiet pre-dawn dark. As we move deeper into the lived structure of the divine elite, it becomes evident that the gods, far from being anarchic forces of power and miracle, were subject to regulations, routines, and roles, as intricate and demanding as those faced by royal courts. The temple, in this world, was not just a site of worship. It was a palace. And within its confines, the gods enacted lives of ceremonial governance, bound by rituals, seasonal cycles, and priestly administrations that dictated their every move. When they awoke, bathed, were dressed in silks, offered meals, entertained with music and dance, consulted for blessings, and finally lulled to sleep each night. The resemblance to mortal kingship was no accident. It was, in fact, a deliberate replication meant to assert order, to make the invisible visible, to make divine control as tangible and replicable as that of a human sovereign. Each act within the temple, the daily ablution of the deity statue, the waving of camphor flames, the placement of garlands, the repetition of mantras, was part of an elaborate routine that paralleled and legitimized the governance outside the temple as stone walls. The deity was not merely symbolic, but functioned as the legal owner of land, the head of temple management, the recipient of taxes, and the employer of priests, musicians, dancers, and servants. In medieval South India, for example, great temples like those at Thanjavur or Surarangam operated as complex economic units with hundreds of staff, producing their own food, managing their own water systems, even maintaining their own archives and ledgers. The gods were alive not only in faith, but in law and custom. The land was tilled in their name. The accounts were kept for their benefit. The festivals were performed as their royal processions, complete with palanquins, elephants, guards, and declarations. And yet, beneath this grandeur lay a web of social stratification that deeply shaped and was shaped by the presence of the divine. The caste system, with its intricate divisions and expectations, extended into the divine realm, not in the sense that gods were casted themselves, but in the way that specific deities came to represent and reinforce particular varnas. Brahma, the creator, though rarely worshipped in popular practice, was associated with the Brahmins, the learned, the priestly caste. Vishnu, the preserver and ideal king, found favor among Kshatriyas, the warrior caste. Shiva, complex and contradictory, appealed to ascetics and those outside conventional caste boundaries, even as his worship was co-opted into royal temple traditions. And goddess cults Shakti in her myriad forms were both liberating and regulating, empowering women and lower castes in some contexts while binding them to rigid ritual roles in others. The gods then were not outside caste, they were deeply embedded within its narratives, reinforcing the dharma of each social group while offering divine justification for its place in the cosmic order. Temples themselves were spatially organized along caste lines. Only certain individuals could enter the sanctum sanctorum. Others could perform music or dance. Still others were relegated to cleaning, cooking, or watching from the outer courtyards. The rules were strict and the roles hereditary. Service to the deity was a life's duty, not a matter of personal choice. It began in childhood, was shaped by training and ritual initiation, and continued across generations. In some temples, priests memorized thousands of mantras, passed orally with intense precision, maintaining traditions that had outlived kings and empires. This stratified sacred labor created a divine court that was both exalted and exclusionary. For those within its favored castes, especially high-ranking Brahmin families, the temple offered prestige, stability, and spiritual power. For others, it was a system of containment. Yet even within this rigidity, there were moments of fluidity, stories of saints from humble origins who won divine favor, of goddesses who appeared in dreams to grant blessings of village deities, that refused to conform to orthodox structures and instead demanded devotion in their own chaotic, earthy ways. These liminal spaces in the sacred order offered brief but potent reminders that divinity was not wholly tamed by caste, that gods could still act outside the scripts written for them. Still, for the majority, the divine palace was a place of duty and structure, of roles so rehearsed they seemed eternal, and of rituals that transformed myth into administration, worship into labor, and belief into bureaucracy. In this palatial life of the gods, the sacred and the secular blended so completely that the line between priest and politician, between offering and tax, between dance and service, became beautifully blurred. And at the center of it all stood the deity silent, stone-carved, adorned with flowers and gold, watching as humans moved in practiced devotion, upholding a divine hierarchy that reflected their own. As the divine hierarchy continued to mirror and enforce the social reality of ancient and classical Indian civilization, the gods' roles became not only reflections, but reinforcements of human structures, institutionalizing themselves within temple rituals, Vedic chants, and royal patronage. One could say that, in this arrangement, the gods became bureaucrats of the cosmos, cosmic administrators, whose responsibilities aligned with both sacred and civic structures. This third layer of palace life among the divine reveals an intricate system of governance, delegation, and ritualized dependency, where gods functioned within a meticulously arranged web of obligation. Each god's domain, whether agriculture, rain, learning, wealth, or destruction, was respected, invoked, and maintained by human activity. But just as kings had ministers and aides, so too did the gods have divine functionaries. The Navagrahas, the 9 planetary deities, were consulted for timing and fate. The Dikpalas, guardians of the cardinal directions, protected sacred spaces. Even lesser-known figures like Kubera, god of wealth, or Shani, the harsh teacher, associated with Saturn, occupied fixed roles in the celestial machinery. Their tasks were defined, their expectations laid out in scripture. No god, however mighty, operated alone. And even the Trimurti Brahma, Vishnu, Shiva, acted within limits, subject to cosmic cycles and the laws of karma. Unlike in monotheistic models, the Hindu divine was distributed, decentralized, and constantly negotiating its position. Yet even within this careful structure, divine politics was anything but peaceful. Myths overflow with rivalries, tests of loyalty, power plays, and cosmic negotiations. Consider the stories of Indra, once king of the gods in Vedic tradition, whose jealousy and insecurity often led him to disrupt ascetics' meditations, fearing their tapas might challenge his supremacy. In these tales, Indra is less a distant, omniscient god and more a political operator, guarding his throne like a mortal monarch. Or take the narrative of Surya, the sun god, whose brilliance became unbearable to his wife Sanya, prompting her to leave and birth demigods in her absence. Even the gods' families were fractious, their relationships tangled in duty, neglect, betrayal, and longing. These stories, often recited as moral tales, served a deeper function. They normalized the imperfections of rulers, divine or human, and provided templates for navigating conflict. They also reflected a deeper philosophical truth central to Hindu cosmology, that all existence, including the divine, is entangled in samsara. The cycle of birth, death, and rebirth is shaped by karma, not whim. Even the gods are bound by the consequences of their actions. There is no absolute impunity in this cosmos. Temple inscriptions from the Chola, Pallava, and Vijayanagara periods often recorded the roles of gods in local governance. Temples were endowed not only with lands, but with rights over markets, irrigation, and even legal matters. And at the center of each temple stood the deity, not just a spiritual figure, but the symbolic ruler of the domain. Kings referred to themselves as servants of the deity, and royal edicts were sometimes issued in the god's name. In the great temple of Ranganatha in Srirangam, Vishnu is treated as an emperor. Rituals follow a courtly schedule. Offerings are processed like taxes. Priests function as ministers. The god is awakened in the morning, offered a ceremonial bath, clothed, fed, entertained with music and dance, and finally laid to rest at night. These cycles continue daily, seasonally, and annually, repeating with such discipline that the god's palace life becomes a metronome for human society. Here, ritual is not just devotion, it is administration. And the god is not a distant being on a throne of clouds, but an ever-present ruler who must be pleased, attended to, and served. And what of the people who enacted this service? Priests, temple dancers, sculptors, gardeners, cooks. Entire castes and subcastes existed solely to support the palace life of gods. Their roles were hereditary, regulated, and embedded in local economies. The dancers of the Devadasi tradition, for instance, were once considered brides of the deity, performing sacred arts within the temple compound. Over time, their status declined due to colonial misinterpretation and social reform, but originally they formed an essential aspect of divine courtly life. Likewise, temple musicians, known as Nagaswaram players, trained for decades to perform the daily raga that would accompany the deity's rituals. These roles were not merely professions, they were vocations sanctified by myth. Their labor kept the divine household running, just as palace staff kept a king's court functional. In some cases, gods were believed to reward their servants in dreams or visions, guiding them through illness or family strife. The god's presence was not symbolic, it was administrative, emotional, economic, and constant. This intertwining of caste duty and divine obligation reached its zenith in the social codes laid out by the Dharmashastras and the epics. In the Mahabharata and Ramayana, gods take incarnations to reinforce dharma across different strata. Rama, as a kshatriya, upholds royal duty and justice. Krishna, as a divine trickster and strategist, offers philosophical guidance while defying convention. Their lives validate the roles expected of mortals. But they also complicate them. Krishna, in particular, is both king and cowherd, both charioteer and god. His actions blur caste lines, suggesting that divine identity is not always bound by social hierarchy. And yet, these moments of fluidity do not dissolve the system, they merely expose its fragility. The gods, after all, can transcend caste. Mortals, rarely so. Their hierarchy remains largely intact, reinforced through ritual, education, and myth. But in these small ruptures, in stories of love across castes, of gods favoring the humble over the noble, there lies the possibility of reform. A whispered promise that the palace of the gods is not as rigid as it appears. Even today, remnants of this divine palace culture remain. In South India, temple towns like Madurai and Chidambaram still operate around the rhythm of the deity's life. Processions draw thousands, not merely as spectacle, but as reenactments of the god's royal presence. In the Himalayas, deities are paraded through villages on palanquins. Their moods interpreted by oracles, their consent sought before decisions are made. In these moments, the god is both present and political, a participant in the affairs of humans, a ruler not just of heaven, but of the land, the crops, the marriage arrangements, the monsoon expectations. And the people respond not only with faith, but with structure, with prayers timed by almanacs, rituals overseen by lineage priests, songs composed in classical meters. The palace remains, even if invisible. And the caste of the gods, though no longer rigidly enforced still, echoes in how we organize the sacred, how we imagine power, how we assign value to ritual. As twilight settled over the towering shikaras and the temple bells offered their final chime for the day, the gods were ritually put to rest, but the machinery of their palatial existence never truly ceased. Behind the silence of sanctums, the temple complex remained a microcosm of sacred governance, not by kings, but by the rituals of divine sovereignty. The gods, like rulers, had their treasuries, their schedules, their regents. The temple treasury guarded and audited with the same fervor as a royal vault, held gold, jewels, silks, and sacred utensils donated by devotees or accumulated through temple-owned lands and businesses. Each item had ritual significance. Gold vessels used only on festival days, particular silks reserved for the monsoon season, lamps that must be lit only on new moon nights. The gods' wardrobe was extensive, and their food schedule, Nivdu, was meticulously planned, aligned with celestial timings and the agricultural calendar. In certain traditions, the deity was fed 6 times a day, each meal changing with the season, the weather, and even the local harvest. Cooks, themselves ritually purified, prepared offerings in silence, supervised by head priests who dictated recipes rooted not in taste, but in cosmic appropriateness. Food was not merely sustenance. It was a dialogue between the human and the divine. It's a way to sustain the god's energy and, in return, receive blessings. This ritual infrastructure created a form of divine realism, where gods were not abstract ideas, but entities with daily needs, moods, and responses. Temples employed astrologers to determine the god's favorable hours. Some temples believed their deity required occasional rest from human gaze and closed their sanctums for days during symbolic retreats. Others celebrated their deities' wedding anniversaries or enacted ritual battles between rival gods, all with scripts rehearsed and performed with the seriousness of political theater. These enacted narratives further entrenched the temple's role not only as a site of devotion, but also as a producer of social memory. Through these performances, myths were lived, reinterpreted, and localized. The god of one region might marry a goddess from another town during a joint festival, forging alliances that mirrored those of human kingdoms. Divine politics reflected and shaped local identity, economy, and hierarchy. And through it all, the caste structure remained the framework by which access to these rituals was distributed, interpreted, and maintained. Yet this order, for all its stability, was never truly still. In times of social unrest or shifting regimes, temples adapted. A new dynasty might elevate one deity over another, fund new shrines, or alter rituals to align with their royal ideology. In these cases, the god's status could change. A village protector might be recast as a form of Shiva. A local goddess could be rebranded as a consort of Vishnu. These theological promotions were accompanied by architectural expansions, priestly reassignments, and scriptural reinterpretations. The divine hierarchy was fluid beneath its stone surface, and these shifts revealed how gods, like kings, required political patronage. The palace of the gods, then, was both sacred and strategic, a place where belief and power negotiated their borders through incense and decree. Even the very language of prayer evolved in response to socio-political needs. Mantras were modified to reflect new cosmologies. Hymns were translated into vernacular languages to reach wider audiences. Temple art depicted newly canonized legends to bolster theological claims. At the heart of this transformation stood the priesthood, hereditary yet dynamic, conservative yet responsive. Priests were not mere functionaries. They were theologians, economists, archivists, and diplomats of the sacred. Their education began in early youth, and they spent decades memorizing not only rituals, but entire bodies of philosophical commentary. They knew which star governed which ritual, which flower belonged to which goddess, which syllable must not be mispronounced. A mistake in ritual could mean divine displeasure, crop failure, or social disharmony. And so, the pressure upon these custodians of godly order was immense. Some lived lives of austere discipline, avoiding garlic, alcohol, even the gaze of women, while others became powerful figures with wealth and political influence. In certain times and places, the head priest of a major temple wielded more local authority than the regional king. Yet even they were not autonomous. They answered to councils, temple boards, or royal decrees, ensuring that the temple's function as a public institution was never fully private. Through all of this, the elaborate rituals, the caste-based organization, the political alliances, and the shifting divine hierarchies, the life of a god in the Hindu temple was one of relentless ceremonial governance. The god was always on display, always the object of someone's devotion, anxiety, or aspiration. Their statues were not silent observers, but animated presences believed to receive, to respond, and to demand. Even in sleep, they were said to dream the universe forward, sustaining time with each exhalation. And so, while the outer world changed with empires rising and falling, inside the temple, the cycle of ritual remained, patient, precise, and eternal. The gods sat still, but everything around them moved. Hands lifting offerings, voices chanting, feet sweeping thresholds. The palace remained lit by oil lamps and guided by stars, and the gods within, for all their divinity, lived lives scripted as meticulously as any mortal monarch's. This was not transcendence beyond the world, but divinity lived fully within it. Entangled in human rhythms, cast in stone, and crowned with jasmine garlands each morning anew. Within that eternal rhythm, the gods became more than symbols. They were the axis around which belief turned. Their temples stood not just as places of worship, but as entire ecosystems of devotion, economy, and tradition. They were built on centuries of layered mythology, each brick infused with prayer, each corridor echoing with footsteps of pilgrims who had come bearing hopes, debts, and gratitude. The gods, whether carved in black basalt or cloaked in cloth and garlands, were repositories of memory, and every dawn ritual, every monsoon festival, Every sung mantra was a thread in the ever-expanding tapestry of myth and society. The divine lived not above, but through the people, mirrored in their joys and sorrows, reborn in every child named after them, and alive in every story whispered before sleep. Thus, the caste of the gods persisted timeless, ornate, and ever in motion, carried forward by incense and intention. And still, the temple gates remained open, not only to the faithful, but to time itself, which never ceased its slow erosion and renewal of even the most sacred walls. In the centuries that followed the peak of Hindu temple culture, these palaces of the gods continued to evolve, reflecting the shifting sands of belief, empire, and culture. Some temples grew into bustling complexes spanning city blocks, while others faded into overgrowth, their deities relocated, forgotten, or folded into the identities of newer, rising gods. The caste of the gods did not die, they transformed. A once local rain god became an aspect of Shiva. A fertility goddess of one valley was absorbed into the pantheon as Parvat's regional form. And even foreign influence as Buddhist, Jain, Islamic, and colonial left their subtle imprints. The palace life of gods became more symbolic in some cases, more ceremonial in others, but never irrelevant. Even in the modern age, where steel and silicon rise higher than any shikara ever could, the gods remain. Their temples stand amid traffic and neon signs, their festivals broadcast live, their processions regulated by police barricades, and yet the same rituals endure beneath it, albeit sometimes abbreviated, sometimes translated, but still tethered to the ancient rhythm. The priests, now with smartphones in their pockets, still recite verses first written in palm leaf manuscripts. The garlands are still woven by hand. The lamps are still lit with ghee, their flames dancing quietly in devotion. In these moments, one glimpses a continuity that no empire or ideology has fully broken. And so, the divine caste continues not merely as a relic, not solely as heritage, but as a living axis of meaning. For some, the gods are still kings. For others, they are metaphors. Yet within the palace walls, these distinctions blur. The temple is not a museum. It is a breathing archive of faith, a system of order built on ritual repetition, sacred geography, and generational memory. Every offering, every drumbeat, every flower placed upon a cold stone idol is a link in an unbroken chain that stretches back thousands of years. The gods do not demand perfections. And through that presence, a village, a caste, a city, even a solitary believer finds alignment with something vast, ancient, and ineffable. In this final act of palace life, the god is both center and periphery, both sovereign and servant of the world's rhythms. They preside over cycles of sowing and harvest, birth and death, marriage and mourning. And through the structure of the temple's caste divisions, its rituals, its festivals, its silences, they offer a scaffold for meaning in the chaos of existence. Even when politics falters, when economies collapse, or when languages disappear, the gods remain in song, in stone, in story. Their palaces may crumble, their rituals may evolve, but their presence lingers, not just in marble sanctums, but in the imaginations of those who whisper their names. Thus concludes the long ceremonial day in the palace of the gods, not with a flourish, but with a slow, sacred closing of doors, the dimming of oil lamps, the hush of evening prayers. Echoing down corridors worn smooth by centuries of barefoot devotion. Outside, the world spins faster than ever. Inside, within the castes and columns of devotion, time folds gently inward, and the divine rests not above, but deeply within the intricate, eternal architecture of human belief.